For the Andover Historical Society in Andover, New Hampshire, I'm Ed Hiller, and welcome to This Old Town. Ralph Chaffee came to East Andover in 1924 to manage the Halcyon Hills Farm of 500 acres on Emory Road. Chaffee became a true town father in his adopted town of Andover. He was a selectman for 30 years, a trustee of trust funds, a library trustee, a town moderator, and school district moderator. Ralph Chaffee was also a writer and an amateur historian. His History of Andover extended the documentation of the town's history from where George Eastman's History of Andover left off in 1906. In 2007, the Andover Historical Society published Elder Moody's Hat and Other Stories of Andover, a collection of newspaper articles he originally wrote in the 1960s. This program and others to follow present excerpts from that new book as read by current Andover residents.
In the spring of 1761, the village area was part of a tract granted to a group of proprietors in 1751. Since the first granting of a charter, Andover has had three forms of government. From 1751 to 1753, management was conducted solely by the non-resident proprietors. The area was then known first as Brownstown and later Emerystown. In honor of two of the more prominent proprietors for the next 6 years, until July 13, 1779, the territory was an unincorporated township known as New Britain. The first meeting of inhabitants to consider incorporation of a township was held in the home of Joseph Fellows, the first settler and one of its leading citizens as the community grew. The first town meeting at the time of incorporation was on July 13, 1779, held in the original church building at what is now East Andover. This is a crude structure, costing only $64 to build. It was both church and meeting house.
From a small beginning, the infant town grew. The old church structure remained long after it became inadequate and unsatisfactory. Finally, in disgusted at its disgraceful condition, one Paul Smith Marston of the Flaghole district, with his sons and a few neighbors, so badly wrecked it one dark night in 1795 that it had to be destroyed. For this act of sabotage, they were given a supper at a nearby tavern. This affair brought matters to a head, and a new church structure was soon raised where it stands today on Route 11. For another 43 years, this new church doubled also as a meeting place for the township. It was not until 1840 that the town finally voted to relinquish all claim to the church and turned it over to the Christian denomination for purely religious purposes. After that, town meetings were held mainly in tavern halls or the Union Church. Recognizing the eventual need for a real town hall, a new and long-lasting controversy arose. Site after site was suggested and turned down by one group or another. While the center village would seem to have been the logical choice, East Andover and its outlying districts lined up against Andover Center, Potter Place, and West Andover, and the two groups were so evenly divided that neither could gain more than a temporary advantage over the other. A town meeting vote passed in the morning to accept a proposed site might be rescinded and thrown out later in the same session, for those early town meetings often lasted the entire day.
Finally, tired of the endless controversy, a board of selectmen in 1879 broke the jam with a well-planned coup. Arrangements were made quietly with one Hiram Fifield for the purchase of the half-acre lot. A deed was drawn up, ready for signature. When town meeting opened, a vote was passed to purchase this tract for the sum of $75. During a recess for lunch, the selectmen met with Mr. Fifield in their office, where the deed was quickly signed and notarized and the purchase price paid over. After dinner, when the usual motion came up to rescind the morning vote, the moderator declared it out of order as the transaction had already been completed. Once started, matters moved fast, for the 1880 town report gives a complete record of the building committee, showing a total cost of $1,987.20 for the building, 2 big pot-bellied stoves, the huge old safe, settees, fencing of the lot, and other items.
Surrounded by garages and an automobile graveyard stands a large wooden building which has been for 82 years the Andover Town Hall, attested to by the 1879 high up in the gable end with wide upside-down 2 instead of a 7.
The new town hall had many uses beside the political. Dances, traveling medicine shows, and local dramatics provided entertainment before the days of the movie theater and the automobile. More recently, after a town high school was built in 1934, the wooden structure had doubled as a gymnasium and basketball court. Now, in 1961, another controversy seems likely to threaten the continued existence of the town hall as such. No argument over location this time, but rather between sentiment and economy. Sponsors of the new building program suggest the sale or abandonment of the town hall in favor of the new gym as a place for future town meetings, pointing out a large annual saving in heating cost and upkeep. On the other side stands a group of older citizens to whom the old hall, with its pleasant memories of past town meetings and social activities, represents more than just a building. Rather, it has become an institution, a landmark in the history of the town that, like the few remaining covered bridges, should be preserved for posterity. They fear, too, that the most democratic of all forms of local government, the old-fashioned New England town meeting, stands to lose a little more of its distinctive color and flavor if transferred to a new, modern setting.
The principal town officers were the same in 1866 as they are today: selectmen, tax collector, town clerk, and police. And their main duties were about the same, allowing for the differences bound to occur over a span of 100 years. In addition, there were many minor officials. There were pound keepers to take care of stray livestock, fence viewers to arbitrate disputes between landowners over their fence lines, and inspectors of wood, lumber, and bark to guard against short measure in transactions involving those commodities. Many things were bought and sold in barrels and tubs, and in towns where cooperage was a local industry, there were cullers of staves to check on size and quality. There were hog reeves to handle stray hogs. But, quote, swine unlawfully at large upon the highways in any town cannot be legally seized and impounded on Sunday, and a hog reeve who seizes and impounds swine on that day is a trespasser. There were mild fish and game laws in 1866, and if it was deemed necessary, a town could elect or appoint a fish warden to, quote, prevent the taking of fish out of season or by any other means than angling with hooks and lines.
March 28, 1962 was moving day for the selectmen. Like the library trustees, they were glad to get into more commodious quarters, for the little room in the old town hall was piled high on all sides with old records. The biggest part of the undertaking was moving the massive old town safe weighing several tons, which was purchased for $150 back in 1879. The selectmen wondered what treasures of the past might turn up in the inaccessible corner behind it when the safe was moved out of its 80-year-old resting place. Along with plenty of dirt and cobwebs were several dozen 1908 Andover Town reports, each in a yellowed manila envelope. Also found were a bourbon whiskey bottle, empty of course, and a really old brown pottery bottle containing the dried remnants of what the label described as calligraphic writing fluid.
April 5th, 1962. About a month ago, the bell in the belfry of the old Andover Village School rang for the last time to summon pupils to their seats. Now the youngsters, with their teachers and their desks, occupy 2 sunny rooms in the new central school, and the 89-year-old school building stands partially empty. But not for long. Already the selectmen and the town clerk have moved their offices into the smaller front room and are open for town business. The larger room at the front is about to become the new home of the Andover Town Library. This will be a welcome move for the library trustees and patrons. The old library room on the second floor of the Proctor block has long since become too cramped, and the flight of stairs left much to be desired by older patrons. Since its beginning in 1892, this library has twice run into misfortune. Its first home was in the Proctor Academy building, the remodeled Union Church. When this burned in 1901, all the books, except those in circulation, were lost. The town people immediately went to work to replace their loss. When a new academy building was built, the town library was given a second-floor room there, in which it remained until 1912. Its next move was across the road to the so-called Proctor Hall, in the same building that has remained its permanent home until its present move is completed. Fire struck again in March 1928, destroying the third floor and the Masonic Hall above. This time, most of the books were saved, but somewhat for the worse for the soaking of Bradley Lake water.
Of all the early schools, we know most about the one on Tucker Mountain. We know most about its history because the last teacher here, in 1892, Miss May Hersey, and her sister Edith, carefully preserved the original record book of the district. Let's let Miss Edith tell its story in an article written in 1928. And I quote, "There's a little red schoolhouse in Andover on Tucker Mountain, still standing where it was built about 1838. The old records relate how the contract was let to Benjamin Tucker for a schoolhouse and porch, as the woodshed is called, to be built at a cost of $110 on land Tucker had donated. And there it stands today, sturdy and staunch. The whole house was indeed built upon honor, nothing flimsy in its whole construction. Even the floorboards have never been renewed after generations of wear. The heavy plank desks, cut and scarred by generations of jackknives, are still firm and strong. It was at one of these desks, a back seat by the window, where the teacher was one day helping the bad boy of the school with some naughty problem. He was more intent on a sly joke with his neighbor than on the lesson, seeing which the teacher gave his hair a small pull and smash went her elbow through the window pane. This teacher was a good sport, so a hearty laugh cleared the air. Education then was a serious matter, and the little schoolroom was sometimes crowded with as many as 30 pupils. Some of the boys literally grown men. They studied hard and played hard in those days, and many a successful businessman and woman give thanks for the sound principles learned in their early days in some little red schoolhouse.
If the little group of settlers on Tucker Mountain were justly proud of their school, the residents of some of the other districts probably had reason for being less so. No one could describe conditions more vividly than the Honorable John M. Shirley, superintending school committeeman in 1863. Probably Andover's most outstanding lawyer, Mr. Shirley unhesitatingly called a spade, and in his report to the town, he berated his fellow townsmen as follows. In number 8, the Backroad School, with inclined seats, rotten frame, sunken floor, yawning roof, open walls, broken seats, remnant panes, and shattered door, the gloomy relic of the Saurian period still stands. In the hot days of summer, the sweet perfume, the delicious aroma of the privy, for which a part of the house and a slice of outdoors is used, fills the room with a perfect fogue, as the old ladies say. Straining the intelligence of God into babies' minds through a privy vault may be a new but not a useful invention. Evidently, lawyer Shirley's admonitions fell on deaf ears, for 2 years later, he again takes up his cudgel. My back road friends, I have worn out all language, human and satanic and divine, upon you, and yet your saurian relic, rain save, snake privy, owl rookery, and bat tympanum still stands. The story in Andover was repeated many times with local variations in many small New Hampshire towns. But despite the hardships, many future leaders of the state and nation somehow managed to continue the education which first began in the little one-room schoolhouse.
In 1846, the Northern Railroad reached East Andover from Franklin. Then it swung due south through the village to get around Loon Pond and back on course again across the plains, through Andover Village and on to West Lebanon. So quickly did the railroad become a commonplace thing in the life of the communities that Professor John Eastman, in his 1910 History of Andover, saw fit to give it only 3 short paragraphs. For the most part, the railroad was laid out through some of the less valuable areas of Andover, disturbing few dwellings and farms. While we cannot tell at this late date just what lay in its path, the total amount of land damage awarded by the county commissioners for the entire 10 miles or more through the town was only $6,547.70. The first locomotives were wood burners. To keep them going, thousands of cords of hardwood were needed. This created a brand new market for cordwood along the rail route and employment for a small army of men to cut and haul it. With the laying of the rails came the little stations and freight houses at East Andover, later named Halcyon, Andover, Potter Place, and West Andover, Gale. The most elaborate was at Potter Place, which was the railhead for Wilmot and New London. Once, these little stations were beehives of activity, and there were many trains. Boxes and crates of supplies for stores and farms were wheeled into the freight houses. Baggage trucks full of milk cans awaited the morning train south, and passengers in considerable number took off and returned. Carloads of cattle went south to market, loaded from cattle pens and chutes beside the tracks. So conveniently spaced were the train schedules that one could entrain in the morning, spend the day shopping in Concord, Manchester, or even Boston, and return the same day on the evening peanut train.
Water towers were another adjunct of the railroad. The one at East Andover was filled by means of a hydraulic ram operated by a water wheel in the basement of the hosiery mill. The railroad paid $10 per month for this service, at least in the 1930s. The town became obliged to take over this property for taxes, and when repairs became necessary, the selectmen suggested that the railroad pay an additional $2.50 per month, or $25 a year. To help defray the cost, this the railroad refused. The selectmen then served notice that after a certain date, the town was all done supplying the tower and the Boston and Maine could do whatever it saw fit. Negotiations began in earnest, ending in the erection by the railroad of a brisk pumping station at the outlet of Highland Lake, with a large new pipeline deeply buried below the frost, extending to the tower, all at the outlay of perhaps $7,000 or $8,000 to save the payment of a paltry $25 a year. With all this going on, the Boston and Maine was already in process of changing to diesel power, and the new system was in use only a short time before it was abandoned.
Today, the railroad seems less important to small towns like Andover than at any time in its history. Gone are the stations at Halcyon, Andover, and Gale, and that at Potter Place stands like an empty shell waiting for someone to find a use for it. Gone too are those earlier station agents, often colorful characters, who handled the freight and sold tickets to any place in the country. They watched the spinning wheels of passing trains for hot boxes, and besides helping to guide the trains safely on their way by messages over the telephone wires, often delivered sad news or good from the outside world, received over those same wires for 40 years before the telephone. At times, tragedy has also played a part in the history of the rails. From the early days of wood burners, down through the coal burners to today's diesels, fires have been set by sparks from locomotives. Perhaps the worst destruction occurred on May 23, 1871. The writer's father-in-law, Irwin J. Flanders, witnessed this as a little boy of 7 at the old East Andover School. Through the schoolhouse window, he saw sparks from a wood-burning locomotive set fire to dry grass and a board fence a little distance up the tracks, but dared not speak of it. To call attention to the fire would be to admit looking out the window instead of at the lesson, which was strictly forbidden and brought down quick punishment. Otherwise unnoticed in time, the fire spread to destroy the home of Major Nehemiah Emerson, and along with it, the first Free Will Baptist Church nearby.
New Hampshire offers something of a paradox. It is one of the most highly industrialized states, yet thousands of acres of thinly populated and forest areas, dotted with lakes and ponds and hills, give an entirely different impression. Here, the tourist and recreational business ranks above all else. Andover and its surrounding towns have always ranked high in this respect. The first type of summer business was the taking in of summer boarders. The network of railroads built in the 1840s and 1850s opened up the countryside to easy access by train. Slowly at first, and then more rapidly, whole families from down country began coming to New Hampshire for quiet summer relaxation. At the same time that the railroads were bringing in summer boarders, more and more of the native sons began to answer the call of the growing West. Agriculture, as our forefathers knew it, began to decline. Young men left the farms, but the summer boarders increased until boarding them became the principal source of income for many a farm family. The majority sought quiet relaxation rather than excitement, and for many of the elders, the most strenuous exercise might be walking or playing croquet. Farm and village homes were enlarged and remodeled to make room for more boarders. Often the farm family moved into a back room or even a tent for the summer, so that every room could house a paying guest.
Many who first boarded in and around Andover learned to love the country and discovered that many of the fine old farms and village homes, then going into decline, could be purchased at bargain prices. These in turn influenced friends and associates to do likewise, and soon quite a summer colony developed. Still others acquired land and began to build cottages around the lakes. One such was Charles Denning of Concord, who first came to East Andover as a boarder and remained to build the first cottage on the shores of Highland Lake, well known as 5 Oaks.
With the coming of the automobile, people began to get around more freely, and the number of those summer boarders who formerly came by train and remained in one locality during their summer vacations gradually began to decline. To accommodate these newer tourists, something new came into the picture, the overnight guest cabins. Offering more mobility and privacy than the boarding homes, but at less expense than the big summer hotels, these were extremely popular for a time. Today, as we get back to modern times, the overnight cabins find increasing competition and are slowly giving way to the better appointed but more expensive motels.
Early in 1901, a group of 5 or 6 Manchester sportsmen were talking together about hunting and fishing. a suggestion came up that the group form a sportsman's club and purchase a tract of 1,250 acres on Ragged Mountain in Andover. The suggestion was soon followed up by action, and the present Ragged Mountain Fish and Game Club came into being. When the owners of the Corbin's Park Game Preserve in Croydon offered the state a herd of 4 bull elk and 8 cows, the large tract of the new club was selected as the place to release them. The animals were shipped to Potter Place by rail and hauled up on the mountain on a 4-horse sled. Here they were turned loose on March 12, 1903. Soon after liberation, the elk divided into 2 herds of 6 each, and their numbers began to increase. All went well for a few years. People enjoyed seeing them around, and to quote from the history of the club, they were objects of admiration and curiosity, and in the spring could be seen coming down from the peaks at sunset. They increased in number, and how many there were at the highest point of their prosperity could not definitely be settled. One member counted 15 in one herd, another saw 35 in the mountain road at one time.
As the elk herd numbers increased, the local farmers began to have their troubles, and loud were the complaints. Much of the criticism was directed against the Sportsman's Club, which hastened to disclaim any responsibility, as the elk were the property of the state. Claims to the state for damages were refused, as the law requiring payment for any game damage of any sort was not passed until 1915. About this time, the farmers began to take action to protect themselves. Andover's prominent lawyer, George W. Stone, presented the state with a damage claim, and when it was refused, ordered his hired man to shoot to kill. 5 elk were killed in one morning, and the meat peddled around town in a butcher's cart. Furthermore, Lawyer Stone advised others to do the same, stating that he would defend them in court free of charge if the state took any action against them. Elk meat was mighty good eating and came in good-sized packages, and there was plenty of active young men in town who needed no further urging. It was not too many months before most of the animals were shot, and a few survivors moved out into the Cardigan Mountain area. There they too soon disappeared.
M. Morrison was an East Andover character of 60 and more years ago, sometimes referred to as the Hermit of Raspberry Hill. Not far from the Tilton Brook inlet to Highland Lake, a side road turns off north up the side of the mountain to join the old College Road, which in Daniel Webster's time ended up at Dartmouth College in Hanover. Near the junction of these two roads, Adoniram Morrison made his home. For years he lived under a rude shelter made of a few boards slanted against a stone wall. Finally, a group of sympathetic neighbors built him a crude hut, but it was some time before he could be induced to live in it. Victor Phelps of Andover, born in Tioga, recalls how Morrison would appear at his home with a pack on his back, from which he would extract a big slab of salt pork and ask his mother to cook it for him. This she would do with a generous helping of potatoes added, to give him an occasional hearty meal. Where he got the pork, no one knew. To a large extent, he lived off the land on fruits, berries, and nuts, and was said to have an excellent set of teeth from this simple fare. One day in March of 1902, he was found dead in his hut by neighbors who had missed seeing him around for a few days. The selectmen of the time obtained a coffin and buried him in the Lakeside Cemetery without benefit of a funeral, for which they were criticized by many.
Another eccentric East Andover individual remembered by many today was Arthur A. Briggs, whose parents came here from Orange in 1882. Young Arthur was born in Orange in 1859, was well educated and a graduate of Harvard, and practiced medicine in the West for a short time. For some reason known best to himself, he gave up his career and returned to the family home. His hobbies were geology and botany, and so well versed was he in the latter subject that Harvard University sometimes consulted with him on problems of plant identification. Perhaps no one in this section was more familiar with the White Mountains, which he had explored extensively by bicycle and on foot. Mr. Briggs was camera shy and refused all requests to take his picture. Once, while out blueberrying, a summer visitor managed to get a snapshot without Arthur knowing it. Or so he thought. Leaving the camera unguarded while filling up his berry pails, the visitor was surprised to find it smashed on his return.
Many town regulations existed in the olden days, but few were applied to the sale of milk. Milk was milk, even if produced under very primitive sanitary conditions, and was okay for sale provided the flavor was good. One spring, two men were working together on some inside job when one began to feel thirsty. "Do you happen to have anything cold to drink?" he asked. "Yes, there's a bottle of cold milk in the refrigerator. Help yourself." He poured himself a glass and tasted it. "Where did you get that milk?" "From Farmer so-and-so. Why?" "Well, next time you get any milk from Mr. So-and-so, ask him to put the milk in one bottle and the manure in another, and we'll mix them to suit our taste."
For the Andover Historical Society in Andover, New Hampshire, I'm Ed Hiller, and welcome to This Old Town. Ralph Chaffee came to East Andover in 1924 to manage the Halcyon Hills Farm of 500 acres on Emory Road. Chaffee became a true town father in his adopted town of Andover. He was a selectman for 30 years, a trustee of trust funds, a library trustee, a town moderator, and school district moderator. Ralph Chaffee was also a writer and an amateur historian. His History of Andover extended the documentation of the town's history from where George Eastman's History of Andover left off in 1906. In 2007, the Andover Historical Society published Elder Moody's Hat and Other Stories of Andover, a collection of newspaper articles he originally wrote in the 1960s. This program and others to follow present excerpts from that new book as read by current Andover residents.
Town histories tell us a little about some of those who lived here before us, but there are dozens more for whom a simple marble slab in some burying ground remains the only record. Go back a little further in time, before any kind of lettered monuments were obtainable. Here and there we find a little cemetery where only common fieldstones mark the graves. There is one such small burying ground on a bank beside Old Emory Road. Here, in a 20-foot square enclosed by rusty iron posts and wire, are 6 graves. They are marked only at head and foot by moss-covered stones, nearly buried now by the forest leaves that have been gathering around them for generations. Who were these people? No one knows, and nothing can be found to identify them. The little plot is located on what was known as the Walker Farm, on the road to Flaghole. But Israel Walker, who came here in 1833, was even then its third or fourth owner. First, to actually reside there in 1774 was the town's first settler, Elias Reno. The town history tells a little about him. I quote, "He was a rough frontiersman, not noted for a saintly temper or for conspicuous abstinence. Tradition relates that in a domestic crisis, the old soldier thought his wife's hot temper would be improved by a cold bath in the well." Elias Reno died in 1787. No record states where he or his wife were buried, and perhaps they are two of those who now sleep beside the old highway. Some distance back in the woods on the opposite side of the same old Emery Road is another more historic burying ground. Here, the town's first pioneer settler, Joseph Fellows, was laid to rest in 1811. Here also were buried his wife Margaret, his son-in-law James Randall, and the latter's 8 infant children, and tradition has it, 2 friendly Indians. As in the other cemetery, the individual graves are marked only by fieldstones. 100 years later, the townspeople erected a single granite monument to the memory of their first citizens. But which graves are theirs, no one knows.
Let's look around in the old North Church Cemetery at East Andover. Here lies Captain Caleb Marston, farmer, lumberman, and early road builder. In his lumbering operations, he hauled many huge pines from town down to the Merrimack River. From there, these 60 and 70-foot trunks were floated down to the sea to be shaped for masts for sailing ships. Here also lies Paul Smith Marston, the captain's father, an early settler in the Flaghole area. It was he, with Caleb and another son Israel, who chopped down the old original $64 meeting house one dark night to pave the way for a better structure.
Not far away lies tavern keeper Charles Hilton, who rewarded the Marstons with a supper and stimulants when the destruction was finished. Nearby in Proctor Cemetery, one finds many names well known in Andover history. The Honorable Nahum Batchelder, a native son who became governor of the state in 1903. John Proctor, another native son, a leading citizen and benefactor, who left his name and part of his fortune to its academy. Professor John Eastman, U.S. naval astronomer and compiler of the Andover history. John Shirley, a lawyer whose reputation spread far beyond his adopted town. Dr. Henry Weymouth, the old-fashioned country doctor, who spent his life administering to the ills of Andover folks. Clarence Carr and other members of that family, who built up the town's largest industry, the U.S. Haim Company, and many, many others.
The little cemetery behind the old North Church in East Andover is quiet and peaceful now. Back in 1824, however, a gruesome and terrible thing happened. Mrs. Mary Wadley Hilton, wife of the tavern keeper, died on October 12th. She was 72 years old. After a proper funeral, her body was buried in the Hilton family row, and her story should have ended. That was not to be. We are indebted to a neighbor for an account of what happened next. And I quote, "To the great astonishment of all, it was discovered on the next day her grave had been opened and her body carried away. Excitement and indignation knew no bounds. One clue and another were followed, and it was soon learned that the stolen body had been driven by team to the medical college at Andover. Several arrests were made and courts were held at different times, but sufficient proof was lacking, and the culprits escaped justice. Mortal remains of Mary Hilton were never recovered, but a small marble monument to her memory was erected with the inscription, "Body stolen after burial."
When the proprietors of what was later to become Andover mapped their property back in 1753, they set aside 3 lots for the first settled minister of the gospel, to be his for life and his heirs thereafter. There's no mention in those early records about the separation of church and state. Until 1840, the town built and maintained the meeting house and likewise paid for a parsonage and a good part of the minister's salary. The first minister given a call to settle in the little community was Josiah Babcock, or Badcock. It seems to get written both ways, a young man of 30 and a graduate of Harvard. Now that the little town had secured a pastor, it had to provide a place for him to live. And we know quite a bit about the building of that first home on what is now called Hillside Farm. Among the bills paid by the selectmen was one amounting to £1.04 for the rum consumed at the raising on November 8, 1783. Meat for the raising dinner came to another £9. If any parishioner objected to the long sermons and stayed away from Sunday services, it was probably his privilege to do so. Nevertheless, he was still assessed a minister's tax, to be paid for in cash or labor, and that was that.
Priest Babcock, as he was often called, proved to be not only a faithful pastor, but a good businessman and an excellent farm manager. Much of his salary was paid in services, and he put every hour of his free labor to a good one. More and more land was cleared until the home farm was nearly all in fields and pasture. Reverend Babcock was said to be a fair and just man, but always insistent in his demands that money due him be paid in full or in kind, regardless of the hardship it might cause the debtor. From those who paid in labor, he demanded a full day's work, often regretting that the winter sun set early to shorten the workday. One man whose job was criticized angered Babcock by replying that he guessed it was as good as the preaching. According to the records, the farm was taxed for the first time in 1810. No doubt the free labor ceased then also. More years slipped by. As his father grew older, William Babcock took over more and more of the farm management and inherited the place upon the pastor's death in 1831 at age 79.
This story concerns a character seldom seen today in this area, the professional tramp or hobo. Even in the early days, there were a few individuals who preferred a vagabond life to acquiring roots and a permanent home. According to old accounts, these first wanderers were a different breed from the colorless characters of more recent times. They were tellers of stories, offered tricks and entertainment in return for food or a night's lodging, and were not unwelcome as a diversion in the stay-at-home life of the early settlers. These early wanderers posed no great public problem, depending as they did upon handouts from individuals. Before the turn of the century came a different breed, surely misfits and outcasts, with no thought of giving anything in return for whatever could be scrounged from the public. It then became a community rather than an individual problem to supply a minimum of food and shelter for the penniless transients who became stranded in a town at nightfall. From about 1900, Andover town records show increasing expenditures for the caring of tramps, and certain individuals were hired to maintain overnight tramp accommodations at so much per head. At first the price was 50 cents, later 75 cents, and finally $1 for a supper, a place to sleep, and a bite of breakfast to start off the morning.
The story of the tramps would not be complete without explaining a little about the system used in handling the wayfarers. No tramp was given an order for the night before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, on the theory that if he hastened, he could make the next town before nightfall. After the deadline, he could hunt up the nearest selectman. The latter would write out an order, a slip of paper saying, "Please put this man up for the night," dated and signed by him. Whereupon the man trudged his way to his assigned lodging, surrendered his order, and was given a simple supper, a place to sleep, and breakfast to start him on his way in the morning. Few had to be given directions where to go. Each tramp order was good for $1 from the town, and soon became legal tender with any local merchant. The writer first came into personal contact with these knights of the highway in 1933, at the beginning of his freshman year as a selectman. That was not a particularly bad year, with only $127 spent for 127 hotel accommodations. The next 2 seasons were even better, and then business began to pick up. 160 selected Andover as their stopover in 1937. The service must have been excellent at our hotels, for in 1938, 392 gentlemen of the road signed the registers, or would had there been a register to sign.
Something had to be done, and the selectmen decided to do it, law or no law.
Called on the phone at his home in East Andover, Constable William Miller Sr. was told that as of now, the town fathers were issuing no more tramp orders. From now on, each and every applicant would be referred to him as Chief of Police for transportation to Franklin for an overnight stop in a police cell. For the remainder of 1939 and during 1940, not 1 cent of the taxpayers' money was spent to house tramps.
By what signs on the roads leading into Andover the message was conveyed that the welcome mat had been taken in, no one will ever know.
A local business that manufactured wooden hames, that's spelled H-A-M-E-S, for horses' harnesses first began in Andover in 1865. After being combined with a similar concern in Sunapee, it was known as the Consolidated Hame Company until 1902. In that year, it was further consolidated with other firms in Buffalo, Cincinnati, and Tell City, Indiana, and all were incorporated as the U.S. Hame Company. For younger viewers, hames are the curved wooden or metal reinforcements on a draft horse's harnesses. Originally founded and principally owned and managed by the Carr family, this was the most important manufacturing business ever established in Andover, employing as many as 100 men. The Andover plant turned out wood hames, the New York and Indiana plants steel ones. It was located on Bradley Lake Road, just after the Beach Hill Road intersection. Gradually at first, and then more swiftly, the demand for steel hames increased, and that for wooden ones dwindled. Finally, automobiles, trucks, and tractors replaced so many horses that there was small demand for either. The western plants, equipped for handling steel, were converted to the manufacture of other products. Operations at Andover ceased in the late 1920s. The Andover Village Water District purchased the water rights and the remaining properties of the company in 1937.
The former Winter Hill Ice Company plant, located at East Andover, April 7, 1960. The ice plant, located in East Andover, was said to be the largest ice house in New England and perhaps in the entire country, contained under one roof. There were 12 separate houses or compartments to the ice plant, with 12 loading doors opening onto the railroad tracks. The plant was built in 1911 by the Winter Hill Ice Company of Boston on the shores of Highland Lake, just a short distance west of East Andover. For 18 years, Highland Lake was the scene of great activity during ice cutting season. Many local men were hired to supplement a hard core of company employees who were sent up by train from Boston for the ice harvest. The Boston men were boarded by the company in a building that once existed on what is now called Ice House Lane. Some 20 or more of the company's horses were brought from Boston by rail to pull the snow scrapers and other iced harvesting equipment. Winter's iced harvest was stored in the ice plant, and in summer, an average of perhaps 10 cars of ice were shipped out daily to Boston. In the late 1920s, man-made ice and electric refrigeration destroyed the market for natural ice, and East Andover's ice plant was torn down in 1930.
From the end of the Civil War to the beginning of the 20th century, the way of life in small New Hampshire country towns like Andover changed only slowly. Then, around the year 1900, several new and wondrous inventions hit Andover almost simultaneously. The first to reach the most people was the telephone. A corporation known as the Potter Place and New London Telephone Company was formed, and at its first meeting at Potter Place in 1899, plans were laid for the telephone line between the two villages. Meanwhile, the Kearsarge Telephone Company had been formed in Salisbury, with many shares of stock purchased by Andover residents. In 1901, this company petitioned for and was granted a license to extend its lines into Andover. Within a few years, telephone service became a reality in many parts of the town. Gradually, as more phones were installed, the local lines became overloaded faster than the new lines could be put in, until on some lines an almost intolerable situation developed where 19 or 20 families shared one single wire.
In 1902, Oscar Davis lived near Potter Place. A local correspondent wrote, "Oscar Davis has a gramophone and amuses himself by giving concerts over the telephone wires. A short time ago, he gave concerts in Newport, Claremont, Salisbury, Franklin, and Concord at the same time." About the first mention the writer can find on this subject is in March 1902, when the darkness and poor conditions of the streets of East Andover were deplored, and a move was started at a meeting of the local improvement society for each householder to place a lighted lantern before his dwelling each evening to help out the wayfarer. According to another record, John Hopkins, the proprietor of the former Hotel Potter, purchased for $5.50 a lantern to place on the New England telephone pole in Railroad Square in October 1902. The late Harley Hopkins of Andover and Franklin fell the task of being the first lamplighter in Andover. Not to be outdone by Potter Place, Colby and Durgan at East Andover were soon sporting a new street lamp in front of their store, and a year later one appeared on the church lawn. It was not until 20 years later in 1922, after the formation of the East Andover Light and Power Company, that electric lights appeared in Andover village streets. During the same year of 1902 that the little kerosene lanterns appeared on East Andover doorsteps, the local correspondent to the Journal Transcript wrote, "Our people saw the first electric light in town Thursday evening when a new plant installed at the box shop by Kidder and Whittier was set in motion. It works finely and is a novelty for the novices."
In 1900, Henry Ford, Gaston Chevrolet, and others had already begun to put the country on wheels, but only occasionally had one of their productions chug slowly over the dirt roads through the town. Franklin had the first locally owned automobile 3 years before Andover. In May 1902, E.W. Haynes of that town was the first owner of a horseless carriage. According to an account in the local paper, it was purchased from the Automobile Company of Springfield, Massachusetts, had an 8-horsepower motor, a speed guaranteed of 30 miles per hour, and cost $1,000. Frank W. Durgan is said to be the first owner at East Andover, with a Stanley steamer runabout in May 1907, and Perry Flanders, the first at Potter Place, with another Stanley. Within a year or two, there were several others, and by 1910, a dozen or more in town. Albert C. Cochran at Andover was the first to sell gasoline from cans at his hardware store, and he had the first hand-operated gasoline pump in town. The Riverside Garage at Sillyville, which opened on April 1, 1918, by Albert J. Sanborn, was the first to offer repair service. According to the town inventory, there were 151 horses left in 1928, as against 294 in 1902. The shift from horse to motor car was only half completed.
Most doctors earn their degrees as a result of years of study and hard work. Others, like Dr. James G. Mao of Tucker Mountain, East Andover, acquire the honorary title from the local people, among who they circulate. James Mao came to Andover from Hill, purchasing the old Greeley farm off the old Tucker Mountain Road near the Little Red Schoolhouse. Mao was a confirmed bachelor, bringing with him an aunt who was his housekeeper until her death. Thereafter, he lived alone, preparing and peddling the concocted medicines which were his chief claim to fame. Probably his best-selling specialty was a cough and cold remedy labeled Dr. Mao's Expectorant, and many old-timers swore by its efficiency. Dr. Mao was an eccentric individual, seldom seen without a scarf round his neck, no matter what the season, which he referred to as his wampum. It is said that he never changed his underwear in winter, but added another layer as the weather got colder, and often wore 3 coats, one over the other. In the room of his Tucker Mountain home, which served as both kitchen and bedroom, there were 2 stoves, which were used on alternate days. He seldom bothered to saw his stove wood, but kept the long sticks propped up on chairs or horses, to be shoved along into the fire as the ends burned off. Before retiring for the night, he would lay a fire in the unused stove for the next morning. From his bed, he could reach across the room and light it by means of a bit of birch bark on the end of a long stick, delaying getting up until the room was warm. Not all labor-saving devices can be credited to the modern age. James Mao died March 8, 1915. His Tucker Mountain home continues to be known as the Dr. Mao Place.
Major Everett Emmons lived near Boston Hills Schoolhouse on Andover Plains. A small man, peppery in disposition, he reminded one of a bantam rooster and must have been quite a ladies' man in his younger days. The title of Major was authentic as well as honorary, for he had indeed held a commission at one time in some guard unit. As to being a ladies' man, the fact that he'd married 5 times speaks for itself.
Everett Emmons, with his 3rd wife, Viola, purchased a little Andover farm around 1934. The Major had quite a collection of firearms, and he and his wife both enjoyed target shooting. Sometime later, Viola Emmons took sick and died, and in June 1939, the Major took his 4th wife, a Mary Buzzell. This marriage lasted only 3 months, to the day she was killed in an automobile accident. The Major drove no more after that, which was safer for the general public.
About a year later, the Major, then 74, married a woman of 40 whom he had first hired as a housekeeper. Certainly the marriage was no romance. From all appearances, the new bride thought that Everett Emmons was quite well off and was willing to cut herself in for a slice. Discovering her error,
she soon decided to clear out. When she so informed her husband, the Major seized one of his numerous firearms and threatened to take his own life if she did so. This being a Saturday afternoon, Fred Emerson, Henry Pillsbury, and I, the selectmen at the time, were in session at the town hall. A phone call came from the town's police officer, William Miller Sr., asking us to come at once to the Emmons place.
There we found the excited Major on one side of the bedroom, his wife on the other, and poor Bill Miller separating them in the midst of a family scene. Assuming as nearly as we were able, a solemn, judicial manner, we listened to the story all over again. This took some time, but can be quickly summed up, the wife repeating, "I won't live in the house with so many guns," and the Major countering, "Louise, I love you and I want you to stay." Now, town fathers are supposed to have all the answers, so we suggested a compromise. Bill Miller would take all the guns in the house into protective custody. This done, Louise would agree to remain at her new husband's side like a faithful wife. This she did for about 24 hours before leaving with bag and baggage for parts unknown. She has never been seen nor heard of since. This time the Major decided to make the best of it and live alone with his cats and a billy goat.